Hello, everyone. We're going to talk today about the major causes of World War II. This is part two. Last time, in part one, we've gone over the Treaty of Versailles, the rise of nationalism, Nazi and fascist ideology, and the Great Depression. Today, we're going to focus on Japanese expansionism. We're going to talk about appeasement and then U.S. isolationism. So let's go all the way to the Japanese expansionism. And so in order to get back to Japan, we have to go back all the way to the Treaty of Versailles. So Japan was at the Paris Peace Conference, and they had two main things that they wanted out of the Treaty of Versailles. The first thing that they had wanted was more territorial gains. Mainly, they had wanted a lot of the islands from Germany that were German colonies, and they wanted to have a foothold here in the Pacific. The other thing they mainly wanted was the provinces in China. So they wanted different regions that would have been very key, including the Shandong, or Shandong, I believe it's pronounced, region, the peninsula here, right on the northeastern coast of China. And so they had wanted a lot of that. And the other thing that they had wanted at the time was that they had actually proposed to the Paris Peace Conference and to all the nations that were there a racial equality law. And what that meant is that if all agreeing nations, so all those at the Paris Peace Conference, had wanted to, or would basically agree that all races are equal and are the same. Now, what this really meant was that the Japanese had wanted for their immigrants, the people who are leaving Japan, to go to nations like the United States, to go to Britain, to go to Australia, to go to France, would be treated just the same as, essentially white Europeans or white Americans going to other places. This doesn't necessarily mean that, say, for example, like if the United States had signed this treaty, that all of a sudden, all our racial problems would be solved. For example, like it probably meant that African Americans were not going to be, still treated better, overnight due to the Paris Peace Conference. But what it would allow is for Japanese citizens to be able to basically go throughout the world and to immigrate more freely. And be treated as equally as Europeans, because essentially Japan wanted to show that they were an equal player in the world stage, along with America and along with the major European powers like Britain, France, Italy. And actually, their proposal for racial equality actually got a lot of support, but the problem was that it didn't get a lot of support from Britain and the United States. Because Britain had was getting a big push from Australia, who had just wanted to keep Australia essentially white and European in ethnicity, and so they didn't want Japanese citizens coming over into Australia, and so Britain's hand was pushed by them, and then because the United States had needed Britain support in order to pass the Treaty of Versailles and a lot of the different aspects of the Paris Peace Conference. Ultimately, Woodrow Wilson, the head of the Big Four and basically the chairman of the Paris Peace Conference, then said that it's like he basically said, well, the measure failed, even though it had more support, by most nations. And so that led to a lot of resentment from Japan, because essentially they felt that, number one, that they didn't get what they wanted out of the treaty, despite the fact that they got some territorial gains in the Pacific. Number two, they felt that they were kind of just seen as, their racial equality measure got just pushed over because, they came from Japan and it wasn't from a major European power. And so they felt that they weren't being recognized as major players on the world stage. And they also felt that, because of their race and because of their ethnicity, they felt that they were seen as inferior. And so a lot of different tensions kind of started to bubble up, after the Treaty of Versailles and Paris Peace Conference. And Japan also started to become more aggressive in that manner. And the main thing that they did is because they already had, and I'm pointing over here, they already had Korea, that was an annexed state. So it basically mean that they already had control of the Korean Peninsula, today where North and South Korea are. And it started to slowly take over more control of China. Now, China and Japan are major rivals, and for quite a while, anytime Japan, after Japan became isolationist, I'm sorry, for the most of Japan's history, they were mostly isolationist, which means that they just kept to themselves. They didn't let people in, and they didn't really let people go outside of Japan due to their island state. But very quickly after they got rid of the isolationist policy, they started looking at China. And the main reason they wanted China is number one, it was the largest threat, as they were the major power in East Asia. Number two, um, they also could use a lot of the natural resources in China. I mean, think about if you're an island nation and you have a very limited amount of resources to be able to have, well, but then across the ocean, across going over to the west in China, there is a much larger nation with much different resources, much vaster resources. So there's a lot of advantage for Japan to try to get a foothold in China. And so slowly over time, they start to invade different parts in order to have a foothold in China, in order to gain more resources, to continue their industrialization, to try to make them more westernized, and also to be able to um, build like a military and be able to kind of become the major player out in the Pacific, because China exactly wasn't the most unified at the time. So it actually became very easy for the Japanese Empire to come in and take a lot of Chinese land. So next cause is the idea of appeasement. And this is kind of going back over to Europe. So in part one, I'd covered that Hitler and fascist dictators like Hitler and Mussolini were starting to build, basically their own little empires. And the problem is that they then expanded in land. But slowly over time is that Hitler was and Nazi Germany were starting to go against a lot of the provisions of the Treaty of Versailles about having to pay war reparations, which was basically abandoned during the Great Depression. So they were let off the hook from that. They, for the most part, they also had to, demilitarize. Well, Hitler very shortly after taking power started to build up their military again, and then they also started to militarize the Rhineland. They started looking at different areas that they wanted to take over eventually. And France and Britain looked at this and they were like, okay, they gave in. And that's what appeasement is. Appeasement is the act of giving in to an enemy's demands in hopes of avoiding a further conflict. Because of how bad the Great Depression was and because of how bad World War I was, Britain and France's main goal was that they didn't want to basically give up any more of they just wanted to avoid war, because if they their big fear was if they fought Germany and if they fought Hitler, then they would basically get stuck in another World War One, using trench warfare and fighting like a 4 or 5 year war, and millions were going to die, and it was just going to be absolutely devastating. This is only maybe not even 20 years later after fighting World War One, which is an incredibly devastating war. So the so Britain and France were actually very keen on appeasing Hitler. Um, Not necessarily that they respected him, or his ideologies or his policies, but they were just mainly so afraid of going to war that it was easier to give in to Hitler and the Nazi Party than it was to make a stand and try to fight for them. And so very quickly, in a span of a few years, that appeasement, that giving in, all of a sudden gave Hitler um, a lot of different gains that Germany had lost after the Treaty of Versailles. They built up an army. They started to look at land that they wanted to take. And the biggest thing that they won in 1938 is that they actually demanded that Czechoslovakia cede the Sudetenland which was basically essentially a territory in Czechoslovakia that had a lot of German, uh, essentially people who were ethnically German and culturally German. And so Hitler had wanted it, and Czechoslovakia didn't really want to give it up. And so what happened is that Hitler basically demanded to the rest of Europe to say, hey, I'm going to take the Sudetenland. You're not going to be able to stop me. How about you just give it over to me in the first place? Because either I'm going to invade and you have to come and defend. And Czechoslovakia, and I'm going to pull up the map of this just because it's going to be easier. Let's go to 1938 map of Europe. So essentially, I was taking so long to load, but essentially that they basically push Britain and France to have to deal with, which you can see here on this map, the Germany is starting to grow, and so they looked at Czechoslovakia and Sudetenland, and they said, okay, well, we want this land, and we're going to take it by force because they had a growing military because Britain and France appeased them to allowing them to grow their military. So Germany, wanted to take it, and they were going to invade by force, or they basically said, hey, Britain and France, just allow us just to have it, and we can do this peacefully, or we can do this over fighting, and you two are going to have to come over to Czechoslovakia and fight us and our growing military. The main reason why he wanted all this land is because essentially he wanted to incorporate people who were German, of German ethnicity, and he also wanted to gain a lot of land for colonization and more living space for the Aryan race. And so there was a lot of different goals that he had going on. And essentially, when push came to shove, and there were a lot of meetings about this, Britain and France appeased him. They gave in to him, and without really much of a, essentially really without much of a fight at all, which it seems kind of crazy that all would happen. But you got to remember is that their main goal was to avoid war, and so they felt that appeasing Hitler without really taking into consideration, okay, what is Czechoslovakia going to think about this? They weren't even invited to the meeting. Britain and France basically gave away Czechoslovakia to Hitler and to Germany, just in the hopes of, well, maybe this will, hold him off for a while. Maybe he won't go to war. Let him have the East. We don't really care. This might just be the one thing that he really wants, and then he'll just kind of leave us alone. But the problem about that is if you don't say no to, something, it's kind of like, like a little kid. If you don't say no to a little kid, eventually the kid's just going to become entitled and just take whatever he wants anyways. You get like the story, if you give a mouse a cookie, you give a mouse a cookie, you got to give him milk. Then if you give him milk, you got to give him a napkin. Eventually it becomes harder and harder and harder to draw the line in the sand and say, like, okay, no, you can't come over here. And Hitler just kept crossing over every line. And instead of fighting, they just continued to back up. So really, Britain dug themselves in a hole that they couldn't get out of until Hitler invades Poland in 1939, which started World War II, essentially. Now, the last cause of World War II is American isolationism. So what was the United States doing all this time? Well, as we've covered a little bit ago, the United States was in a major depression. And so they were trying to recover from that. They weren't really looking to get involved with a lot of European and Asian politics. And so they basically stayed out of just about everything. And so the big consequence of that is necessarily you can't blame the United States for wanting to be isolationist because of just how poorly things are going in the U.S. And you got unemployment rates hitting like huge percentages, and you've got lack of food, if you got issues like the Dust Bowl and the agriculture industry declining, and you got people living out on the streets. Well, of course you want to fix your own nation's problem first. It took a lot of work through the New Deal enacted by President Franklin Roosevelt to make that happen, and it didn't happen overnight. So the United States was really kind of going through that and trying to rebuild step by step, and it took such a long time essentially they just say, well, Europe, you got to handle it yourself. You know, it's again a notion away. We're going to be neutral, just like we were during World War One. You know, maybe we'll lend a little hand here and there, but we can't really do much because we're in a depression. And you know, Hitler is not our problem, and Japan is really not our problem right now. What they want with China, it's not really up to us. We just want to kind of fix ourselves and stay over here. The major consequence that happened with that, though, is that now all of a sudden Britain and France didn't have an American ally like they had in World War One. Once the United States got into the war, that might have intimidated the Germans a little bit. Not having the United States all of a sudden makes Britain and France more on their own and a little bit more scared of Hitler, thus allowing them to give it to appeasement. And essentially, Hitler didn't face any big foes really outside the Soviet Union throughout Europe. He basically had the continent in his hand. They could do whatever he wanted. Again, outside of the Soviet Union with Stalin in power. But without that American support of the Allied powers, you know, anyone who looked to stand up to Hitler really was like foolish, thus allowing them to go into isolationism. So what I want you guys to do is on Google Classroom, give me 2 things that you've learned and give me at least 1 question. I'm going to go through and answer the questions relatively soon. So feel free to ask any questions that you want about these causes of World War II. I really enjoyed doing that last week with part 1. Hope you guys enjoyed this. I'll see you guys soon. Bye.